loving well and living generously. That is when Ocean Hills is at its best.
I think that because you're out of the baby stage and you're into the, some of you might have junior hires, elementary aged kids, lest you think this doesn't apply to you, even though I'm going to be talking more about what we know initially when kids join us, this still is very applicable because marriages are still challenged and parenting can be all-encompassing. So whether you have a newborn or whether you have a high schooler, hopefully you'll find somewhere that you can relate to in this. So let's start with some facts and what we know. We know that about 3.6 million babies are born to couples every year in the US. So in some ways we're just saying that's a lot. You guys are not, for those of you who do have newborns, which clearly we can hear and see some, you're not alone, right? 3.6 million babies. Unfortunately, whoops, can you guys see? Oh, that's too bad. You can't, you just see the picture. You should be able to see some facts, but thankfully you can see it on your handout. I'm not sure why it's black up there. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, 67% of those couples experience a plummet in their marital satisfaction. So they have conflict and hostility, which increases, sex life plummets, and the marital satisfaction, right? No surprise there. Often we think, I would much rather sleep than have sex, right? I mean, that's when you're sleep deprived. When you have a newborn, it's like, really? Let me just get a couple hours of sleep. But we do know, so sex life drops, hostility increases, conflict increases, and emotional intimacy drops. So, and by the way, this research was conducted over a 3-year period. So it followed couples from birth until 3. So some of you who are still in that stage, even though it's not a newborn, but you have a 2 or 2.5-year-old, this still is applicable, right? 67% said, man, my marriage is suffering. So only 33% actually then reported being content in their marital relationship for 3 years after a baby was born. And clearly something is wrong with this picture, right? And I think what's most ironic is that when a recent poll of Americans was done, and the #1 thing that Americans said they wanted in life was a happy relationship over financial success, stability, home ownership, power, anything of the sort. The #1 thing that Americans said they had desired was a happy relationship. And yet we only have 33% saying that they are content after a baby is born. And I think what is also really disturbing to me is that what research shows us, when there is marital tension and marital conflict, babies suffer. Research for quite some time has shown us when there's marital tension, the junior hires and the high schoolers, we really see them rebelling. We see a plummet in grades dropping. We see more attentional difficulties. So we thought this used to just apply to, the 10 to 16 or 18-year-old range. We actually know, more and more research shows us that when there's marital fighting and conflict and tension, babies actually, potty training is delayed, they're harder to soothe, their cry is more of a shrilling cry, they're harder to soothe. They pick up on it. They pick up on the anxiety and the tension that's in the home. We actually even see speech delaying occurring around 2 and 3 for when a home is kind of filled with tension and discord. So in other words, babies raised by parents who are unhappy, they suffer developmentally. We actually see that they lag behind when we do longitudinal studies and follow them across the board. And also their ability to self-soothe is very slow in coming. When this research came out, I think it was surprising to some in the field. And I did a lot of work years ago at the Brazelton Center, and it wasn't surprising to me because I always used to see Dr. Brazelton, and I would follow him in rounds. And he would go to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston on the maternal unit where babies were hours old. And we would know the mental health history of the parents. And if the mother suffered from a genuine anxiety disorder, literally, we could tell, without even knowing, with being blind to their mental health history, we could tell that if the mom was incredibly anxious for even 9 months in utero, those babies were just harder. Their cry was different. They were harder to calm down. They were harder to soothe. And so what is it that we're trying to just really first educate moms, but give them the tools and the skills, right, so that they can themselves be a calming presence, because our kids pick up on that very much so. So really, we're going to just then look at how then do we maintain marital intimacy? How do we be in that 33%? And how does that percent increase would be my hope, that we could leave thinking, how can we reverse those statistics and have 67% of folks thinking, man, life is good and it's wonderful to be a parent and my marriage is thriving despite the fact that I'm sleep deprived, right? So how do we reverse those statistics? And let's see if I can get this to advance. Thankfully, you guys have. So given, and this is just a list that quickly came to my mind, right? Given that all of the things that demand our time and our attention, and you can change this according to whether you have a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, right? But certainly we know, especially with newborns, they are incredibly dependent upon us, right? We are kind of their, we're their survival. I mean, literally, we are their survival. So with all of these things, it's an endless task. And I know this list is just beginning. And these are just the chores that we divvy up within the home. Right? I know that some of you work part-time, do a lot of volunteer work, and you work outside of the home. So we've got to balance that as well. So I'm going to look at 4 things. And I would go back to my previous slide to put those 4 things up, but I don't think you guys can see it. Yeah, so I'm going to look at 4 things that we're going to talk about today. Of one, how do we engage in conflict? We know conflict is inevitable, so we're going to look at conflict and what it looks like to have constructive conflict. We're going to look at communication. We're going to look at curiosity, and we'll talk about maintaining curiosity, and then we're going to also talk about community as well. So let's start with conflict. We know, as I've said, conflict is inevitable in a relationship, right? There's always going to be conflict, and that is okay. So just like jealousy can be a good thing, research actually shows us conflict can be a good thing. And we actually know, we talk about and we distinguish in the field harmony versus intimacy. So knowing that conflict's inevitable, harmony is when there's conflict without resolution, right? So that's harmony. Intimacy is conflict with resolution. And I imagine most of us in here, we want intimacy. We want to not just sweep the conflict under the rug or avoid it or ignore it or pretend that it doesn't exist. We actually want the conflict with the resolution, which would be more of an intimacy as opposed to a harmony, right? I see a lot of harmonious marriages, but I think sometimes deep down those people don't feel satisfied, and they would be some of the ones reporting marital discontent. So the question is, if we're striving for intimacy, what are some things that we should be aware of and we should know? And I want to start with just talking about attributional styles. So attribution, just the basic definition of that, is how we explain behavior. What are explanations that we give for behavior? And a good amount of research in the social psychological world talks about what we call the fundamental attributional error, which is when I am explaining, and when you all are explaining your husband's behavior, let's personalize this, right? Let's make it about our husband. When we're explaining his behavior, especially his behavior that seems bad or wrong, we make it about him as opposed to the situation. So the fundamental attribution error says, so in other words, if my husband's doing the dishes and breaks one of my favorite platters, oh my gosh, you are so clumsy. You're just a klutz. I can't believe you broke that. So all of a sudden I've made it, that kind of breaking of the platter is about his personhood, as opposed to, oh, that platter is so awkward to hold and it's just slippery and ugh, bummer sort of thing. And then that's about the situation. So when we're explaining someone's behavior and their kind of negative behavior, we very much underestimate situation and we overestimate and we attribute the quote unquote bad or the wrong to their personhood. Ironically, we have another term, I'll spare you all the lingo, but the other term that we talk about is, ironically, what do we do if it's about us? If we broke the platter, we're quick to be like, that stupid platter, it was just too awkward to hold anyway, and it's just a weird shape, and it clearly gets slippery when the soap's on it. Right away, it's situational. You know, your husband's home late for work, and it's just like, oh, you're always late. You're always late. As opposed to, we never think, there was an accident, maybe there was traffic. If we're late for work, it's totally about the situation. There was so much traffic on 101, I just was stuck, and the person before me was going so slow, right? So how do you explain your husband's behavior? Most of us, unfortunately, we make it, especially when it's negative, we kind of assign it to their personhood. It's like, man, you messed up. You're a klutz. You're just late. You're not being considerate, as opposed to looking at the situation. Right? We totally reverse it when it's us, because when it's us, we're like, oh, it's the situation. It's not me that did something wrong. So really thinking, how do you then explain your husband's behavior? Are your attributions enhancing your spouse? Or once again, are we viewing it in the most negative way? Are we attributing the bad behavior to their personhood? And what's important to remember is that when there is disagreement or discord, when we don't agree with what our spouse is saying, It is so incredibly common, not only to engage in the fundamental attribution error, but it's also very common to whine, to complain, to blame the other. It's their fault, they messed up, or deny that anything's happening. And these are, to be honest, these are normal things that we do on a day-to-day basis when we're upset, let alone sleep deprived. And what I actually have found that a lot of moms also do is that when there's disagreement, often moms attempt to control or dominate, especially when we're talking about little kids. And I get why. I mean, I truly get why. And that's because they're thinking, I know what's best. I am full-time at home with this kid while you are off in the office, so I know how to soothe them better, so let me just take over and do it. And we try to control and dominate. And in some ways, we really need to remember here that even though that might be, you might know how to better soothe your child, you've got to let your child figure out the dance with daddy. You've got to let them figure out, you know what, mommy and daddy are different, and how do I engage, and how do I kind of engage in this back and forth? And I think women particularly, you know, I'm sure there's always going to be some kind of whining or like mutterings, but this attempt to just come in and take over, which I see far too often, is something to be really mindful of. You know, it's both you and your husband who are the expert on that child. It's not just you. And I think sometimes moms, and once again, I get why there's this thought of, but I know the kid best, because often we spend more time. But so really important to think about not taking over. A couple other things that we know that we unfortunately do in regards to conflict, and then I promise we're going to get to how do we avoid these things. But a couple other things that we do. So some of you probably know of John Gottman, and I know he's a couples therapist, does amazing research. He's kind of known for his love lab at University of Washington, so at Seattle. Does just amazing work. And what he has found, he describes 4 interpersonal styles that lead to marital discord. And he goes so far to say that a way a couple deals with conflict is going to be predictive of whether they will stay together or not. And so he calls these the Four Horsemen. And the first horseman, and I want to just name these, and you'll see at the end, I'm going to ask you to identify, hey, what do I tend to do when things aren't going well? Like, what's my horseman? Because we need to be aware of this, right? So then we can then, what did somebody say, all of them? Yeah. I was like, no, you won't do all of them. You'll identify your husband undoubtedly in some of these too, and you can talk about that later with him. But I truly think this talk, by the way, is just as much for women as it is for men. And I do give it to a lot of men and couples in general, so please do share this with them. So one thing that we know that we do is we criticize. So we attack our partner's personality or their character, usually with the intent of saying, I'm right, you're wrong. Let me tell you, I am right, you are wrong, so I'm going to criticize you. These are things that begin with, you always, or you never, you're the type of person who, or why are you so, even that why question. When we say, like, especially with our tone, why are you so fill in the blank, we're criticizing. We're putting them kind of automatically like, whoa, I've obviously done something wrong with that why, like, because something can't be right here. So being overly critical is one of his horsemen. The second is holding the partner in contempt. So holding them in contempt is truly just an attacking your partner's sense of self with the intention to hurt them or to insult them. So this is when we're hostile, or we're totally sarcastic, but in a pretty mocking, negative way, right? Some people think, oh, but it's just being sarcastic, but there can be a real negativity to sarcasm. This is insults and name-calling, which sometimes I think, once again, when you add sleep deprivation to this, we never do as well. We're never our best selves. This is even body language. So when we think contempt, think of your body language, rolling your eyes, sneering, those utterances, curling your upper lip. And we actually know that contempt is the strongest predictor of divorce. Because what does it mean when we hold our partner in contempt? We're actually really disrespecting their personhood. We're trying to hurt them. We're being insulting. And this we have found, and Gottman has found, is the strongest predictor of divorce. We'll talk about the antidote to this is appreciation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the third horseman is being defensive. This is when we see ourselves, and this is where I unfortunately can identify with, truth be told. I see myself as like, wait a second, no, it's not about me. I'm going to turn this around and make it about you. We so often can be quick to be like, yeah, but remember when you did that? Or what about, you know why I did that? It's because you did this. So being defensive is when we kind of make excuses. We quickly turn it around. We do a lot of yes, but. I mean, who's a yes butter, right? I mean, we do a lot of like, okay, yes, you give them some, like, throw them a little bit of a bone, like, you're right, but wait a second, remember when, or you did this, which is why it led me to do that, right? So the kind of that's not true, you're the one who, We do more whining when we're defensive and a lot more of cross-complaining. So you meet your partner's kind of, you know, when he's a little bit upset, you meet that with a cross-complaint. That would be being defensive, right? We kind of try to ward off a perceived attack. So when we're being criticized, I'm going to just throw the ball right back into your court, right? I think this is very common that a lot of us just, and here's the thing, sometimes when I work with families and I see young kids getting shamed, they become defensive as an incredibly protective mechanism. And it's good, they need to. But in our marriages, we shouldn't be shaming one another in the first place, and we shouldn't need to worry about whether this person is trying to hurt us, right? In more neglectful or abusive homes, when we see it, and they are being incredibly shamed or kind of thrown, you know, a lot of curveballs, kids get defensive, and I would say they need to. That's their way to kind of survive, because otherwise they're going to feel this big, right? Well, in our marriages, we shouldn't need to become defensive. We shouldn't need to make it about the other. We should be able to just say, okay, yes, I see my role in this. I can see why that was hurtful, right? So this idea of being defensive. The fourth horseman that Gottman identifies is stonewalling. And this is mentally checking out of the relationship. This is when we disagree or we withdraw. Studies indicate that 85% of men fall into this category of stonewalling. So they kind of just become silent. You know, their body language are like, you know, I'm just not going to deal. I've mentally checked out. But what's so fascinating about stonewallers, that as much as we're getting met with this, cold face, kind of no affect, just blunt, just like body language, as much as we're seeing that, and it might look a little bit calm and cool and collected, we actually know that when people stonewall, their pulses are skyrocketing. They're above 100 beats per minute while they are just simply sitting there. So physiologically, they're actually internally out of control. They're what we call flooded. I liken it to, it's like what you would, if you would literally jam on the accelerator and the brake at the same time, right? Because here they are, stony silence, and yet internally, they're kind of combusting and about to explode. So this is when we've got, and like I said, it's really important to kind of recognize 85% of men tend to do this, and we might think, oh, they're still calm with this whole thing, but internally, no, that's not the case at all. So improving, I think, our relationship, which we're about to get to. So how do we do this constructively? Conflict is inevitable. We want to have intimacy in our relationships. How do we improve it? I think one of the first and foremost things is that we need to be aware. Where do we fall? Where do we kind of see ourselves going down that slippery slope in our marriages? So first, if we can identify where we fall, then I think one, awareness and knowledge is power, but we're going to talk about really it's applied knowledge that becomes power. So you can be very aware that, oh, I'm more defensive, but if I don't actually then apply the skills to kind of have more constructive conflict, it's great that I know I'm defensive, but now I'm not going to do much about it. It's not going to build my relationship, my marital relationship. So what are some tools and techniques that we can utilize to engage constructively in conflict? One of the things that I think the biggest kind of overarching is these first two ideas of turning towards and using a soft startup. And turning towards literally, sometimes you have to think, I need to just, my body language needs to just turn towards my husband as opposed to opposite ends or kind of not making eye contact. When we're mad, sometimes we avert eye contact or we're just like ships kind of in the night passing one another. And then so turning towards and really saying, okay, we're going to engage in this even with your body language. And then a soft startup is something that is not, when you think of soft startups, even if you feel like you can't say something positive, so the platter breaks, you know, I could say, thanks for doing the dishes. You know, I could at least start with that, and that would certainly be more of a soft startup than you klutz, like you idiot, I can't believe you broke that, right? So soft startups, either ideally, hey, thanks for just coming to talk with me about this, and if it can't be positive, just a neutral statement of, you know what, I feel whatever it is. I feel upset by the fact that, right? So soft, as opposed to, we're going to talk about I statements, but as opposed to what we often do, which is we just right away get into the negative and the harsh, and we just accuse and we blame. And so we need to have a soft startup when we're about to engage in something that's going to be difficult. We also need to learn to make specific complaints and requests. So when X happened, I felt Y, and I want Z. Right? So learning to make specific complaints. So often we just put it out there, but we actually don't say, this is how I felt and this is what I want. So actually really learning to specifically say, when you were home 30 minutes late, I felt disregarded and frustrated, and I want at least a text or a call telling me you're going to be late. Right? So specific, you learn to be specific. Otherwise, how are you going to how's there going to be effective change occurring here? And then be conscious in your communication. So learning to make specific complaints, then also learning to really be intentional about what is true. I think so often I see, and women particularly tend to just either exaggerate the truth a little bit and are a little bit, can throw more zingers through exaggeration, when really if we're intentional and conscious in our communication, we would speak the unarguable truth. Like, this is what I saw. So almost at first, just leave your opinions and your exaggerations of like, let me just speak the truth of what I've seen. Also, claim responsibility. What can I learn from this? What was my role in this? We need to take responsibility for our part in the conflict, and what can I do about it? Also, validating. Another technique is to validate your partner. Even if you don't completely get the whole thing that he's saying or his perspective, I imagine you can join with one piece of it. You can be like, okay, I get that. I get why you would feel flustered, or you would feel as if I was trying to dominate, or I was emasculating you when I said this comment, right? Validate with some piece of it, even if you think, okay, the rest is he's way out in left field and that was not my intent and that's not true. There's usually something you can emotionally join with. And we certainly know, not only with our spouses and with our marital relationships, but also with our kids, when we emotionally join, which is the word that I use for validation, when we emotionally recognize, wow, you're hurt, you're angry, we see that our emotional brain settles down. We used to always say this in the field of psychology, but now what's so cool is that there's a lot of neat research that we can hook up through fMRIs, people's amygdalas, and we can get brain waves of seeing what's going on after conflict or in the middle of a conflict. And if it's just more of this back and forth, we see a continued spike in elevated activity in the amygdala. When somebody says, hey, you were hurt, you feel so hurt and just disregarded, all of a sudden the amygdala, it's like, oh, they get it. They got me and they understand. So that's validation. When we can emotionally kind of join with somebody else, even if we're still thinking, I just don't get why, that wasn't my intention. I didn't mean to do that. So even if you're still like, that wasn't where I was coming from and trying to be defensive, just still acknowledge what you hear them saying. With our husbands, with our kids, it makes a huge, huge difference in the way that the conversation will go from there. And then we talked about claiming responsibility. Also this idea of practice getting undefended. So in other words, allow yourself to really take in and hear what your partner is trying to say. Don't make it about you. It's not always about us. Try to just listen and actively listen. Once again, we so often, when things are heated, we quickly become like, wait a second, that wasn't what I meant. That's not what I did. And we quickly become defended. So practice kind of getting undefended and let go of the stories that I think we at times might be making up or exaggerating in our own head. Right? And a lot of times, I think we also have to, what I would say is rewrite our inner script, and which means, what is this about for you? Because a lot of times if it's the same dance and you find yourself stuck in the same place, the same buttons getting pushed, that's when I would say therapy is really useful. What is this about? What's your inner script, and what's the story that you have what are core messages that you've held on to? What are ways that you saw conflict handled in your home or avoided? Right? And how have you brought that into your marriage? So that's that idea of rewriting your own inner script. And then lastly, shift to appreciation, right? I talked about the antidote to contempt is appreciation. So this idea of 5 times, a 5-to-1 ratio, and I talked about this when I was here last time in regards to our relationship with our kids. We know this is the same thing with our spouses. 5 positives for every 1 kind of negative comment. Right? So we should be saying 5 things that we appreciate about the other. Hey, I just appreciate that you did the dishes. Thanks for thanks for being home on time. So whatever it might be, can you just say 5 positive things? And then, I'm really frustrated with, or I feel like you're not pulling your weight here, whatever it is. It's great. Like you need that to be expressed, but really think about in our just day-to-day lives, can we be having 5 positives in general to our husband, to our children, for every 1 negative? And of course, I can't help but think of Ephesians 4:32. I love this verse, and it's a fun song that I learned years ago, but I won't sing it for you because I cannot really sing. But it's be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave us. So constructive conflict. Let's look now at communication. I think the thing with communication, and I'm not sure if it's a surprise to you, but literally for 16 years now when I've been doing couples work, And I used to, in Cambridge Hospital in Boston, I used to do a lot of initial calls. When couples would call, I would be at this couples and family clinic I worked and trained at, and we'd always say, well, what's the presenting problem? Number one presenting issue that couples come to therapy for is what? Communication. That's just the catch-all term that people use of like, just, we can't communicate, he doesn't get me. Some level of communication. So that is what, whether we have kids or not, by the way. I think kids might even complicate it because it's really hard to find the time to communicate with our spouse. When we have little ones demanding our attention, communication becomes harder, but also more important. Right? I mean, because we really then need to find the time. So why might it be that communication is one of the #1 problems that we see among couples? It's because about 50 to 65% of the time, we sail right by each other in our communication. We miss the mark, which is actually, when you stop and think about it, it's pretty remarkable. So at the end of the day, when someone's coming home or greeting somebody, you've had your day filled with this, your husband's been at the office or wherever, or vice versa, and we come home and we start just kind of talking. We have to just dive right into it when there's kids needing to be fed and homework to get done, things of the sort. But what happens is about 50 to 65% of the time, we sail by each other and we miss the mark. And by the way, this is when we're operating on good sleep. I mean, truly, those statistics are when we're well rested. That's still a pretty high % of the time that we are miscommunicating. So just imagine when we add sleeplessness into the mix, when we add 3 or 4 kids demanding your attention, your time, needing your help. So good communication is much more difficult than most people want to believe, and effective negotiation is even harder, right? We know that 90% of couples in the US, when they are in disagreement, they use ineffective ways of communicating. So 90% of us use ineffective ways of communicating when we're in disagreement. So what are some of the basic ideas to remember regarding communication? The first being, you guys are responsible for what you say. I mean, I know it's so basic, it's so simple. We teach this to 2nd and 3rd graders, but we need to be mindful of it. You're responsible. You're not responsible for your husband, for your kids, for anything else, but you are responsible for what you say. Right, and how you express yourself, no matter how others treat us, right? That's kind of just a basic, once again, that we've learned years ago. Something else that I think is important to be mindful of is that some of the most important qualities that we see for effective communication are respect, openness, and persistence. So respect gets to, and we're going to talk about soon, friendship, because respect gets to, you know what, you guys, most of you in this room who are friends, you respect one another. And you're then, therefore, because you respect because you're friends, you respect one another and you treat each other well, you would effectively communicate. What's such a bummer is that so often I find that it's within our own families, which is supposed to be our safe haven and our kind of home base and our security, is when we treat each other the most disrespectful. And when we tend to walk away. We tend to not be persistent. We tend to just be like, forget it. Like, you don't get it, forget it. Right? We don't do that as much when we think of close girlfriends, same-sex friendships, maybe because there's not as much at stake, maybe because we're not going to be as vulnerable. But this idea of being respectful, being open, and being persistent is really important to remember in communication, as well as being vulnerable and honest. I think vulnerability can feel so risky at times, especially when we are feeling hurt. I know so many of us, we just have learned, well, you know what, if you've hurt me, I'm going to just put my walls up. I'm going to just then watch out for number one, because you're clearly not being kind to me. And then we choose to become not only less vulnerable, but less honest with ourselves and with our partner. And really, we also then know with this idea of vulnerability and honesty, a lot of times we then might try to almost trick the partner into thinking, okay, well then fine, I'll grant you this, or I might say this. And that's our verbal communication, but our nonverbal is incredibly different. And when we actually look, because we all know we communicate on two levels, right? With our words and with our body language. When we look at what couples and what people in general, whether it's in a couple marital relationship or just in friendships, what do we tend to believe more, the verbal or the nonverbal? That's exactly right, the nonverbal. And so it is so important. So even though you might be saying, oh no, I totally support you, honey, and yet you're feeling resentful, you know what? It's going to get picked up on. There's going to be this sense of, I know there's a mismatch here. They are not being congruent. They're not being honest. So we need to recognize and be honest with our words, and those need to match our actual feelings so that our body language will fall in line. Studies indicate that when we receive messages that are different on these planes, not only do we tend to believe the nonverbal, but you know what? The messenger becomes distrusted. If my spouse is saying to me, no, I really want to support you, but his body language is different, and deep down that's not the case, and I'm picking up on body language, he all of a sudden becomes not nearly as trustworthy in his communication. So slowly over time, if we are not honest with ourselves, and if we're not vulnerable, we're going to lose each other's respect, as well as we're going to lose trust in the other. So incredibly important when we think of both verbal and nonverbal, and this idea of vulnerability and honesty, to there be a match with that. I statements. This is going back to the basics as well. I think simple, and yet I also think this is so profound. I mean, I do teach this to young kids. I go into schools sometimes, and we do fun activities and exercises around start with I. Start your sentence with I. When you are frustrated, when there's conflict, when there's disagreement, I fill in the blank. I feel frustrated, or I want to scream. Even that, I want to scream, as opposed to you're a jerk. And as opposed to just screaming you're a jerk, just say I want to scream you're a jerk. That's even better. If you just say I want to scream, you've started with I. That's a step in the right direction, truly, because you're a jerk just does not. You're going to get nowhere. All of a sudden, whoa, we're going to just be met with either whatever his horseman is. It's going to come right out right then and there. That's not a soft start off. But even I want to scream that you're a jerk. I just want you to know that. That is a huge difference. And I know it might sound silly, but it's so incredibly true. And we see it all the time with couples. So I feel, I want, I need. Those are the ways to begin sentences, as opposed to we so often, you're late. You did it again. You're blah, 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 fill in the blank, right? As opposed to, I'm frustrated because you're late. You can still kind of say what it's about, but just, I'm frustrated because, identify it, right? That is so much more in regards to effective communication. And then actively listen. Be mindful of the fundamental attribution error when you're actively listening, because you might then have a little bit more grace towards your partner, and all of a sudden try to put yourself in his shoes and realize, oh wow, it sounds like he really did try to get home on time, but was caught 3 times, and then by coworkers as he was walking to his car, or whatever it might be. So active listening is huge. And then also expectations. It is so helpful to know your own expectations. What is the outcome that you want from the discussion? And here's the thing. So many of you might say, yes, I'm not really sure. I don't think I have expectations. And I would say, that's just not true. You do have expectations. Know them. Name them yourself, because that's going to really help the conversation go much more constructively and smoother. If you actually know, you know what, this is actually what I want. This is what I want from you. Because otherwise, it's just a guessing game. So you're now expressing this frustration. You're telling them how you feel and saying why you're annoyed. And hopefully a lot of savvy men will be like, okay, I think it is super important that I am home on time, or whatever it is. But actually name what it is that you are expecting from them. Don't make it a guessing game. Because if you're clear, then you know what? That's your bid. That's your bid to your husband to be like, oh, she has told me what she expects and what she wants, and this is important to her. So I need to then respect that in return. And then the biggest thing in regards to communication, because once again, we know that at times there's 50 to 65% of the time, our emotional dialogue is going to get out of step. Reparation is just a fancy way to say repair. What does it look like for you guys to repair? When it hasn't gone well, what do? Right? Do you just say, I'm just going to sleep on it, I'm going to let days go by, or I'm just going to kind of forget about it and I'll work it out myself and I'll get over it? Those things aren't sustainable in the long run, because there's just going to be resentment that builds up. Or there's going to be maybe more harmony, but not intimacy, and you're going to crave intimacy. So this idea of reparation is just, how do you make a bid to say, hey, I'm sorry? Or, you know what, I was too harsh. I've had a tough day, and this is where I'm at. So how do you repair things? We need to kind of persist. We need to turn towards one another, and we need to really be open and honest, and also take responsibility when we think of reparation. And all of this in regards to communication requires a practice of reflection and inquiry, and this idea of practicing over and over. I also cannot speak to, we're going to move to the third point really quickly here, but I also can't speak to how important effective communication is that between you and your husband. It becomes so incredibly important because you've got little eyes watching you all the time. Social learning theory is so alive and well, it sometimes freaks me out, actually, in the sense of I bring a lot of kids into the developmental lab at Westmont when I'm teaching on different stages and ages. And and a lot of times they're my friends' kids that I have come in, and all my students are crammed into this little data analysis room behind a one-way mirror, but they can see and hear us. And meanwhile, the kids or the couple, the parents have no clue that they're back there. So it's super neat, right? We've got all these capabilities to analyze research and things of this sort. And when I sometimes have some friends come in that I haven't seen their kids in a while, so I'm thinking of particularly one faculty member who I don't know them super well, I don't see them a ton, but they always love coming in and helping out in class, and because they're homeschooled, they're able to, which is great, because real easy to get kids birthed until about 5, and then all of a sudden I want to bring a 7 and a 9-year-old in, and I'm like, oh, they're all in school, and I teach from 8 to 10 a.m., how is this going to work? So the homeschooled kids have become my friends. So I bring them in, and I maybe haven't seen them for a while, and I am often, and I usually don't know, in this particular case, it's the dad that I know quite well, and he's a professor. And it seriously trips me out to see how much his little 9-year-old girl, just the mannerisms, the laughter, the facial expressions, I'm like, oh my gosh, you could be your father right now. It's a little bit, social learning theory is alive and well. Your kids are watching you, and they will learn how to communicate based on how you and your husband communicate. They will learn whether I just walk away when I'm mad, or I just kind of grunt or roll my eyes. You know, they're watching, and this is what they're going to take with them. These are the lessons that they're going to learn about communication. And the other thing I like to say about this is that I think so often, especially in the church, we raise kids to believe that it's not okay to be angry. And that's a horrible message. I totally believe, biblically, don't let the sun go down on your anger. I get, and I'm 100% behind that. But never in the Bible does it say don't be angry. Jesus got incredibly angry. He overturned tables in front of people. He was so angry. Anger is totally okay. Your kids need to know that. They need to know mommy gets angry at daddy and daddy gets angry at mommy. But it's more, what do we do when we're angry? That's the beauty that you can teach them, is that anger is okay. It's not going to overpower anybody, but it's all feelings are okay, but it's what mommy and daddy do when they're angry. And if you can model a sweet dance of communication for them, it's one of the best gifts that you can give your kids, right? For them to see a loving parental relationship and for them to see conflict worked out, it's one of the best things. You're giving them tools. Without even realizing it, you're also increasing your own marital satisfaction, but you're giving your kids tools to be effective communicators as well. Okay, third point, and we'll go quicker for these last two. The third point is this idea, I'll let you guys read this, or you might even have it on your sheets, right? When you've been married a long time, you get to know what the other person thinks, says the wife. No, you don't. The capacity to maintain a sense of curiosity about the other is huge when we think of just maintaining healthy marriages and relationships. And once again, and we're going to talk now a little bit about mindfulness and what mindfulness is. Just simply stating, it's this idea of being aware of what's going on when it's going on. So mindfulness is being aware of what's going on when it's going on. It's this meta-awareness, right? It's being intentional and paying attention, essentially. And when we are mindful to our spouse, to our children, just in general, right? When we're actually present with them, we know that research has indicated, one, there's an improved immune function. So that is just cool research that says, like, wow, your immune system is not nearly as compromised when you are mindful and when you are present. We also then know with mindfulness, relationships are improved, both when we think kind of relationships in a horizontal way as well as vertical, right? So with our friends, with our spouse, as well as vertically with our little ones. And mindfulness traits, what are some of them? It's, like I said, being aware of what's going on. So acting aware, being non-judgmental. Let go of judgment. I'm not sure, and I can see why biblically Christ is like, don't worry about it. I'm the judge. We need to just let go of thinking like you're doing this. We can still hold each other accountable. I'm not saying don't hold each other accountable, but I'm saying let go of feeling like you have to be the one to judge what's right or wrong. So let judgmental thoughts go. Non-reactivity is this idea of can you be aware of when you're becoming more flooded, and can you get yourself back to equilibrium? Also, the ability to label and describe with words our own internal world, right? A lot of times, and that's another great thing for kids to see you doing, being able to say, I'm so frustrated right now. For our kids to like hear that and know that, it's only going to help them know okay, like this is what frustration looks like. I've seen it in mommy and daddy at times, and it's okay to feel frustrated. It's not going to overpower me. I see so many kids who literally are scared of anger, and they feel like they're not allowed to be angry. And truly, and they feel like, because if I'm angry, then I'm going to really hurt mommy and daddy, or it's going to, I've had one kid who was like, but it's going to kill them. It's going to destroy them. A young kid who used that word, and I thought, yeah, anger's not allowed in his home. He thinks if he's angry, he's really going to hurt someone. He thinks his anger is so powerful, but what's happening now is he doesn't know what to do with it. So he's just becoming more aggressive because he doesn't feel like he has the tools to actually say, I'm mad, I'm angry, right? And so side note, as parents, once again, and when there's disagreement in your marriages, name what you're feeling. And even all the time when there's disagreement with your kids, I often am telling my kids, mommy is feeling really frustrated right now. You're not listening to mommy, and I'm asking you to do things. Name that to them. That's good for them to hear. I'll never forget, quick story here, my oldest, Kate, was 2.5. I mean, so you think 2.5-year-olds, both my kids have been quite verbal. But I'll never forget, we had just gotten a new washing machine and dryer in our home. And so we had had it for like 4 or 5 months. And from where she was in the kitchen, she could actually see me in the laundry room. And I was trying to put laundry in, and it was not working. And the buttons were like not going. And I was just like, you are joking. This costs way too much money. We've had it for 4 to 6 months. I didn't say anything, but just my facial expressions. Kate walks up to me from the kitchen, kind of parades on over, Mommy, you feel frustrated? I mean, couldn't even at 2.5. I had to. My husband looked at me and was like, did she just say that word? You feel frustrated? I mean, pretty impressed. And I looked, and I kind of took a deep breath. I was like, yes, honey, mommy does feel frustrated. But I remember my husband looked at me. He's like, oh my gosh, she is a psychologist's daughter, isn't she? And I was like, yes, that's right, she is. She knows about these feelings on her own, and she can pick them up in somebody else, which is awesome. That's what you want, right? You want your kids to be able to identify it, not only in themselves, but in somebody else. And it truly was a classic story. I was like, oh, that is impressive. So when we know that when we can be mindful, when we can be aware of our own internal world, when we can be non-judgmental, when we can kind of have self-observation skills, when we teach couples and people mindfulness traits in general, we know at that point we move from being reactive to receptive. Right, so we become undefended automatically. When we can be more mindful, when we can label our own feelings, when we can let go of judgment, when we can be more aware of what's going on, we move from reactivity to receptivity, which is wonderful. And when we are receptive, we know that we can then connect and we can link with one another. So I love one research that's done by Ted Houston. He looked at newlyweds to see where they were going to be in 5 years' time. And one variable that was their trump card was this idea of receptivity to one another. Could they be open to what the other one's emotional responses were? Right? This idea of receptivity is saying you can be open to whatever the emotion, whatever the feeling is. And so when we are open in regards to what the other's emotional response is, we tend to do much better in our marriages. So how do we then actually show how do we show mindfulness? How do we show interest in one another? How do we maintain curiosity? So I bet all of you guys, and if we have the time for the questions at the end here, I want to hear from you of what you do. But let me just give you 3 or 4 ideas of things that you can do to maintain curiosity. And one of the things is think of what you do with your friends. Because here's the thing, I imagine most of you in your same-sex friendships, you remain curious. You don't pretend like you know it all. You ask them questions, you engage, you actively listen, you spend time together, you do fun hikes or shopping or going out to a new restaurant or a girls' weekend away, right? So some things I think, so if you can just remember that, you know what, I fell in love with this person first and foremost because we had an amazing friendship. I like who this person is. So I think if you want to help maintain curiosity in your marriage, whether you've been married for 5 years or 50 years, this idea of maintaining curiosity. So 1, go on regular date nights. Put it on the calendar. I know, I tell you, as I'm up here, I'm thinking, my husband and I have got to get better at that because it just, otherwise, just things come up and we get overbooked or some event or a couple's invited us over, which still counts as a date night, but it's not, it's a double date night, which does not then really count as just a he and I date night. So regular date nights. And then go on different date nights. So what I mean by this and why I say different is do something new with your spouse. Don't go to the same old place. Go to a show. Go down to Malibu, so that great fancy Turkish restaurant that just opened that it's getting all this press, or I'm not always hip and on top of all those things, but do different things together. Why? We know that new experiences activate dopamine and norepinephrine. Dopamine and norepinephrine, those are the brain's reward system, and we get flooded when we have new experiences. These are the same brain chemicals and circuits that are ignited early on in romantic love. They're ignited all the time when you're in that falling in love stage, when you're in that courtship stage. Your brain is getting flooded with dopamine and norepinephrine. 5 years into it, especially with 3 kids along, or 10 years into it with 3 kids along, you know what, you got to do different new experiences together so that your brain will go, oh yeah, this is fun. The idea of your brain needs more of that dopamine and norepinephrine. By the way, it's also the same brain chemicals that are involved in drug addiction and OCD. I mean, interesting. And I say that just because that makes, right, in some ways it makes sense. So it's involved in romantic love early on. It's involved in drug addiction, OCD, things that like we really can become addictive and we enjoy. We want dopamine and norepinephrine to be involved in our marriages. We want our brains to be flooded with that at times because it's like, oh, this is exciting. This is new. This is addictive. I want to be with this person, right? I mean, so that idea of spending time together on date nights, but then going on different date nights. Ask questions of each other. I think sometimes we forget to do that with our spouses. We just ask open-ended questions, right, for them to kind of tell you about their day. From the simple to the more complex, just be mindful of doing that. You do it with friends. Sometimes we forget to do it with our own spouse. 10 minutes a day of talk time would be my other challenge for you and your husband. I might have mentioned this in my last talk, but I think we should do it with our kids as well. Now, and I know you're like, 10 minutes a day? Well, that is so incredibly easy. 10 minutes a day talk time. You cannot talk about chores. You cannot talk about who's taking the kids to school the next day or doing pickup or pediatrician's appointment or who's taking the garbage out or taxes or family vacation or in-laws. 10 minutes a day of just, hi. How are you? What did you think of? I heard this really cool song today, or poem, or whatever it is. Things that you once again probably do with a girlfriend when you've got enough time to connect, and certainly things that you did when you were early on in your courtship. So 10 minutes a day, talk time together. And then I think those are things that are, and I'd love to hear, like I said, when we have some time for your tables, what you guys do to maintain curiosity and build a friendship with your spouse. And then lastly, let's look at community. So for our 4th C, basically, and I think the beauty is most of you, even that are here at this group, clearly you're part of a community. Clearly you're kind of realizing like, hey, we need each other. We need friends who are in this together and who are doing parenting at this time. No one person we know can meet all of our needs. It's just too much pressure. So often when I see couples early on in their courtship, and usually this is pre-kids, and I see it all the time at Westmont with my students, they start dating and all of a sudden, all of their same-sex friendships are just like, what? Who are those people? And the girlfriends feel a little bit left out and rejected because now they started dating somebody and it just becomes, they just are kind of stuck at the hip, right? And usually with marriages, we tend to move away from that, but I think sometimes we become pretty insular. And we actually know that no one person can meet all of our needs. So remain in community, right? I can't underscore the importance of solid, intimate, same-sex friendships. And even more so, seek out friends who are in the same stage of life. And once again, I'm preaching to the choir, because clearly you guys have done that. But we know that it's so helpful for us to be in contact with people who are going through the same stage of life as we are. I think because some of that is we can just look to the other and we can say, this is hard. It's hard. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. And all of a sudden we feel understood because that person's like, oh yeah, I've got 2 or 3 kids too. I'm trying to work outside the home and keep my career and maintain a marriage and take care of myself in the process. And so when we're in community with people who are in the same stage of life, I think there's this common bond, which is, once again, I'm preaching to the choir here. And then I think it's also, and a lot of this has to do with because it normalizes our experiences, right? When we are in community with those who are in the same place, we feel like, oh, yeah, okay, it's not just me. Somebody else gets it. And then we feel a little bit more normal, right? So it's good for us to realize others are in the same boat. And then lastly, this idea of kind of imago Dei as well as kingdom marriages. Imago Dei is just saying we are all relational beings, right? We're created in the image of God. He has made us to be in relationship, whatever that looks like, right? And certainly marriage is, I think, one of those, the utmost that we can be in, to truly be sanctifying one another, iron sharpening iron. The idea of kingdom marriages, I just think we need more of them around, in which we say, what what is marriage all about? What is the God-given reason that he has put marriage? And I think truly it's so that first we would both lay down our lives for one another. We would both be willing to sharpen one another, hold each other accountable, and to be salt and light of the world in our marriages. I think this brings glory to God. The world would say marriage is about getting your needs satisfied, and I think in Christian marriages it's about mutual sanctification. And so I would hope that each one of us could think, oh, we're definitely more in that 33% because we're striving to have kingdom marriages and bring God glory through our marriage. I'd love to take questions from you guys, but I also know that we don't have a ton of time left. It's 10:40, so you also have questions for reflection on there that I'd love for you all to think through and talk with at your table. Thinking about attributional style, where do you fall? So in other words, do you tend to be quick to find fault with the other? Or maybe are you pretty good at taking the situation into account? You don't have to do all of these, but which of the four horsemen kind of resonates with you? Which one do you feel like, oh yeah, this is where I tend to, and maybe which do you feel like, where's your husband at this as well? And then I'd love for you to share with your table communication strategies that work, that you and your husband use. I know sometimes my husband and I use, it's probably me who more implemented it, but it's a rating scale. Of course, I'm the therapist here, so 1 to 10, like how important is this to you? Because if I'm an 8 and you're a 5, maybe we should kind of compromise because I feel pretty strongly about this. So whether you want to use a number or more just say when you're feeling like there's gridlock, right? Gridlock is like, we're just stuck. We don't see eye to eye in this one issue. And this decision that we're going to make about spending our vacation time to go be with family or just be with ourselves. So be with extended family. When you're feeling stuck and just not seeing eye to eye, I think sometimes even just saying, like, hey, well, how important is this to you? And you can do the 1 to 10, or you can just kind of use words. Sometimes a scale might help. And then I'd love to hear you guys, even at your tables, commit to some sort of action step. What is one thing that you can commit to as a way of showing interest, maintaining curiosity and showing interest in your husband? So what's something that maybe resonated with you that you could try to do?
We have about 15 minutes, so you may want to just choose one and then get to the end if you want to do the action step, or just know that you probably won't get through all 4. So
I know.
pick the one that you,
I might have chatted too long.
You have just been fabulous. Thank you
You're so welcome. Yeah. And I'm happy to take questions if you guys have them collectively as a group. I'm truly happy if there are any that right away come to mind, or you can just go into the table talk.
Yeah, I'm open to it. If you guys would prefer to use the time that way, that's totally fine with us. We want it to be for you guys. So. I have a question.
Yeah.
For the horsemen, what is your advice on when you have different horsemen? So you kind of like the love languages, yours is different, and you kind of have to play the other person's. So, I'll give you an example. My husband is definitely a Stonewaller because I'm like, are you listening?
Right.
So then I start to turn into more of mine. And so because we're so different, how can you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say the first, and that's, by the way, not unusual. We often see that, especially when we've got more of a Stonewaller, the other person becomes a nagging fill in the blank, right? Because they're like, oh, I am going to get you to engage. We call it we've got a pursuer and a withdraw. Like truly, and a lot of times in relationships, I see one is a pursuer and one tends to withdraw. And here's the problem. That dance becomes toxic over time because when the one withdraws, the pursuer is like, you are not going to, like, what? Are you listening? That was a great example of that. And so that's what we see happen. So one, I would say, name it. Like you and your husband should talk about that. First name and let him know, like when you go into kind of that stony silence, I just want everything in me wants to just shake it out of you and say, like, you got to give me something. Now, here's the thing. It might be, because I know my husband tended to be more quiet, but some of that was because I'm a very verbal processor, and I'll just keep going and be quick. And he was like, I'm not stonewalling. We did a Gottman retreat before we were even married. Were we engaged? Oh, I think we weren't. Yes, we were engaged. We were the only engaged couple. And he's like, you're making me go on a weekend retreat? I'm like, come on, I love this stuff. This is what I live for. He's like, the introverted architect. He's like, okay. We were the only happy couple there, unfortunately, which was a bummer. But everybody else was married and, like, needed skills, but it was a great weekend for everyone. But we probably walked in happy, and we definitely learned a lot, even in our engaged time. But it was good for me to realize, oh, when he's silent, it's not because he's stonewalling. It's more because he's like, I'm not even trying to formulate a response. I'm trying to still take in what you've just given me. You have just given me so much and so quickly that I'm like, and it took a little bit for us. So now it's just like, I will kind of stop and, sometimes you might say, give me 5. Like, we've got this system of, especially when I'm more heated or, I can be an intense person anyway, but, and then if the New Yorker in me comes out, then I'm really going to talk quickly. And he's like, I actually need 5 minutes to just understand what you've said. And then I will, and so, we have to it takes a little bit longer, but so allow the time for it, right? So I would say, 1, just name it. Name kind of like, just so you know, hon, like when you do this, like everything in me wants to then yell more. And I'm sure that's not helpful, because it's not a helpful dynamic then to have. Then you're just the pursuer is like, I'm going to pursue harder. And that person's like, well, now I'm going to withdraw more because this isn't working for me. So I think a conversation about it is just a huge and awesome first step. And you'll be amazed at how much that changes. And then you can come to an action plan with your husband. So ours is like, he'll just say to me, I've heard you. I need just 5 minutes to really let it soak in. And then and the thing is, when he comes back with a response, I'm usually stunned at how insightful and articulate it is. And I'm like, maybe I should have thought a little bit before I just started talking, but just different styles. One of the reasons I fell in love with him, I remember thinking, wow, you might not always say it, Tom, but when you do, it's like zinger. It's like, you've got it. It's just super impressive, whereas I tend to be, so it's more just naming what's the dance and how are we different in that way, and then recognizing, I don't want Thomas to be like me. Thank goodness he's not. I think it'd give our couple friends, like when people, they wouldn't want to come over to our house for dinner because they'd be like, oh, you guys are just gonna, so it's great. So recognizing there's a difference there and celebrate that difference, and you're not gonna change them, and nor should you want to. But I think just talking through it, I think it's a great question. Yeah, Gail. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because then you've given them power. No, that's awesome, Gail. That's right. Because you've given them power. You're like, now I want to know, like, what can I do to change? Great.
I just want to piggyback on what Gail just said, only because we didn't meet Gail last week. And so Gail is one of our mentor moms, and she is also a licensed therapist, though she is retired. But we call her out of retirement. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody who's new knew who Gail was. So
good person to know. Any other? Yeah.
How do you deal with the perception by your spouse or immediate family that your feelings are wrong? So you try to use the feeling statements, but they're like, my mom recently said, well, feelings can be wrong. So the fact that you feel so strongly about that doesn't make it truth or doesn't make it right. So.
But you can let her know that, so when somebody says, so I'd say, no, that's actually not true. Feelings cannot be wrong. They can't. They're too personal. It's just, you might not agree with my feelings. So I'd rather just say to that person, you might not agree with this, but this is actually, you can't tell me this is wrong. I own it. I feel it. I'm naming it. Sorry that you can't see it or that you can't agree with it, but please don't tell me my feelings wrong. That's never, and certainly that's never a message we want to give to kids, that feelings are wrong. That's incredibly confusing for them, especially because a lot of times we really do feel something strongly, and we kind of need to name it and work through it. But if someone's saying, well, that's wrong, it's kind of saying that's bad and no. So I would just say to them, actually, that's just not true. You're wrong. I'm not sure what else to say to that. That's right. If you go to the psychological community, they would say that is not true. You are empirically wrong on that fact. Any other large group questions? And then I know we'll just have 5 or 10 minutes left.
Yeah, actually, we might as well we have 9 minutes left.
Oh. Yes, Erin.
I have a question about the shaming.
Yeah.
Something that stuck with me from Daisy Merrick's mom was never shame your child. She wrote that in that email, and that just it's always stuck with me. And now you brought it up again about your husband. How, I know you would want to shame them to embarrass them or tear down their core or break their spirit.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by shaming? Or what's the difference when, I can remember my dad being like, you need to really, almost like your conscience, instilling a conscience in them. Like, you should be ashamed of yourself for what you just did. Is that really gentle or detrimental to your child?
Right. And I wouldn't say, I mean, and I don't think we say as much shame on you anymore, but that's been said a lot, and sometimes that is still said. I don't think that's not what I mean by shaming. I mean, if I was going to try to instill in my child or husband, but even this is more probably parental to child, I would say, that is not okay. That's not something that we do. So instead of using the shame on you word.
It's an old word that I think of from like
right.
we were little.
Right. So I think it's just more effective to say, that is not okay behavior. Like I try to really stay away from good and bad. And so for us and our family, it's, and if they've done something great, but I'll say, so it's mostly when I'm thinking I'm trying to correct, that's not okay. So I think the shame on you isn't doing the same thing that shame is. And Aaron, you named it. Shame is really this intentional, you're intentionally cutting somebody down in front. You're intentionally being like, and you know it and feel it. And here's the thing, the person who's doing it, if they really stop, I think sometimes it becomes automatic, which is frightening when we see it's automatic in a spouse, because that's just toxic. You're emasculating your husband, or they're purposely kind of trying to break your spirit. I mean, either way, there's nothing that's healthy or sustainable about that. And I think not only the person who's doing it knows it deep down, even if it's become automatic, but certainly the person who's on the receiving end really knows it. And the bummer is sometimes I think shame can be done in a sarcastic way, and the bummer is that's incredibly confusing too, or the message, the verbal isn't matching the kind of nonverbal or the tone, and that gets to one of those things where you're really sending mixed messages. Now a husband is more just going to kind of begin to withdraw more. When we do that with kids, we actually see in the research that it really leads to more schizophrenic-like behavior, for lack of a better. It really leads to kind of just a kid not being able to be organized. They become incredibly disorganized in their emotional life because they just don't understand why you're saying this, but really your body language and everything about you is acting this way. We actually see research that it shows it might lead to future schizophrenia. It's one of the nurture, kind of the environmental and the nurture causes for schizophrenia. There's a lot of genetic abnormalities. But when there's persistent and consistent kind of mixed messages, which sometimes I think we do when we shame, we might, especially if we're doing it sarcastically or kind of tongue-in-cheek, but yet we know this is a jab. This is an intentional jab at that person. And we do it with kids consistently. It can really be confusing and difficult for them.
What would an example be
of shame or just a mixed message? You guys can help me think of what. Tara, awesome.
Remember I texted you, I was saying Brene Brown?
Yeah.
That was what her talk was about with shame. And she was using it more like in a classroom setting. And so it was like,
yeah. So that wasn't the posing one. That wasn't the power pose. Okay, I have to.
It was their way of disciplining. And so, to make a child feel motivated to do something, it would be like you're in front of the class, like, oh, so-and-so didn't do their homework, whatever. And all of a sudden they feel like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to do that again. But actually, very well.
Right.
So that's like the classroom thing. But you could do that at home too. Where,
Right.
I'm thinking with my girls, sometimes I do like to say, oh, I love the way Everly is listening, and she's going to go get her jammies, and Caitlin will kind of follow suit or whatever.
Right.
But I don't know that it may make her feel like the wrong motivation.
Right. Yeah.
Please, or I don't
Right,
know.
and I would say that certainly wouldn't be shaming. But I mean, that might be more like, okay, I'm trying to use this to motivate Caitlin to go and get her jammies as well. So you could even be, I would say, the more intentional we can be in our language. Like, I love the way Everly's going to get her pajamas. Caitlin, I'd really like for you to do that too. Right? Just name because that's what you're really wanting to say in some ways is, Caitlin, would you please listen? And instead you're just like using Everly as like, look at my shining little golden star who's going to get her, which we all do. And instead it's like, but so you can still thank Everly. But I think what that does, it sometimes pits the siblings against each other too, of like mommy's either kind of siding with one. So instead just be like, thank you, Everly, for listening and getting those. Caitlin, I need you to do the same thing. It's kind of like that direct, assertive. But I certainly wouldn't say that approach. And I think we all do it. I certainly have done it before. So, great. Yeah.
What about saying, I'm so disappointed in you for whatever it was? Like, my daughters were arguing, and one was making jabs, and I separated it and told the older one, like, I'm so disappointed.
Yeah.
And then just kind of, is that shaming?
No, it's not. I mean, so just say, yeah. I mean, you can be like, yeah. And I would even add the like, I feel disappointed. in this behavior. Like, this isn't okay. I'm disappointed by it. That is by no means shaming. No, you've got to be able to, so shaming is truly that intentional, like, I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to get you. And a lot of times shaming's done in front of people, which becomes really hurtful. So that example of in front of the classroom, or sometimes we do it. I've seen it done, unfortunately. Some of our dear friends are just having real issues in their marriage, and despite my attempt to get them to engage in couples therapy, clearly can't be with me. Every time they're at our house, I feel like we're in couples therapy. But thankfully we have another couple to mediate, and it's just dear people. But she is always shaming him. Like, just at just the 6 of us this past weekend, and it just was one of those. And so it's an interesting role that I try to. But it's just, you see it, and everybody knows it, and and it's just like, it's a jab, and it sometimes is. And I think we do it, and sometimes she'll do it with a smile, and she'll do it kind of jokingly, and it's just like, that is hurtful, and that is not okay, And yet they're so used to that dynamic that. But I think so saying, I'm disappointed or I'm sorry is not at all by any means shaming. I know Lori's standing up to, but yeah, one more.
And what needs to be done through kids too, like
yes.
Again, I responded to one kind of passive aggressive one. I'm like, oh, your dad's late again.
Yeah.
I'm talking to the kids, but
that's
I'm
right.
really
Yeah. Right, and you're then, yes, no, that's thanks for just being so honest with that one. I think a lot of us do that, actually. We're fallible, and we're human, and we're tired, and we're frustrated, and we're like, okay, it's hard to be assertive, isn't it? It's hard to be intentional and yet kind. Christy, was your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think for kids, and I'm just listening to your talk kind of made me feel like sometimes I have some conflict with my older daughter about clothes, and she doesn't really set I'm sitting here feeling awful. Whenever we're in a public space, I will say something like, just make a sort of dig about, well, she's got to wear pink. I can't even think of something, but I know, and I look at her, and I can see that it has gone in. So we've had that conversation at home. And I try to, at home, say, you get to choose what you want. As long as it's appropriate, it's not distracting.
Right.
You're not going out in two tops and sequins and whatever. But, she wants to wear this getup, and it's not inappropriate, it's not then I don't
right.
really awful. To make a dig is the worst kind of thing. And I think that's what shaming is to me.
Yes.
Is when you make that passive-aggressive dig at somebody, and when they are, they're not, she has no armor.
Right. It's like, where'd this come from? That's right,
As vulnerable as she can be.
Yeah, and we've all done it, right? Yeah. No. Great example.
One last thing to piggyback, if you're in doubt, did that feel bad when mom said that, or to your husband? Hey, did that feel bad? Because sometimes we don't think it's bad, but maybe it did feel bad, and that's totally what we do.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Lori.
I know the natives are getting restless in the back, the peanuts. But we wanted to tell you about these, and Renee reminded me, and we just want you guys to know they're here. And these are per request cards. So if you have something that maybe you didn't get